The piercing sound of the auctioneer's voice cracked through the dry Montana air as Nora McKenzie turned her back on the crowd, her steps quickening as she moved away from the makeshift platform in Fort Kearney, Nebraska Territory. The year was 1867, and the spring sun beat down relentlessly on the dusty Main Street, where local farmers and ranchers had gathered for the annual land auction. Nora had come with everything she owned, which wasn't much after her father's death last winter, only to find the bidding had soared beyond her meager savings within minutes. "You are my choice." The deep voice rang out behind her, causing her to pause mid-stride. Nora turned slowly, her calico dress swirling around her ankles, to find a tall man in a worn leather vest pushing through the crowd toward her. His Stetson was pulled low, shadowing eyes that locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Pardon me?" Nora asked, her voice barely audible over the continued calls of the auctioneer who had moved on to the next parcel of land. She tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, aware that several onlookers had turned to watch their exchange. The man stopped a respectable distance away, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair with a single streak of silver at the temple despite his seemingly young age. "Isaac Barton," he said, extending a weathered hand. "And you're walking away from the best plot of land this territory's seen all year." Nora straightened her spine, pride stiffening her shoulders. "I'm walking away from what I cannot afford, Mr. Barton. A practical decision, not a surrender." A smile cracked across his sun-bronzed face. "That's what caught my attention, Miss McKenzie, Nora McKenzie." She hesitated before taking his offered hand. His grip was firm but gentle, calluses scratching against her palm. "Miss McKenzie," he continued, "I've been watching you these past 3 auctions. You study the land maps, test the soil, check water sources. You know what you're doing." Nora withdrew her hand quickly. "My father taught me well, but his lessons didn't include how to make money appear from thin air." Isaac nodded, replacing his hat. "I've got a proposition for you." "That land you wanted, I just bought it." Her heart sank. Of course he had. Another wealthy rancher expanding his empire while she struggled to find a tiny foothold in this unforgiving territory. "Congratulations," she said flatly, preparing to turn away again. "Wait." His voice softened. "I need a partner who understands farming. Someone who sees what that land could be, not just what it is." Nora blinked. "A partner, a business partner," Isaac clarified quickly. "I've got cattle expertise and capital, you've got farming knowledge. The eastern half of that property has the best soil I've seen in 3 counties, perfect for crops. The western portion has good grazing for my herd." Suspicion narrowed Nora's eyes. At 22, she'd seen enough of men's propositions to be wary. "And what exactly would this partnership entail, Mr. Barton?" "Equal share in profits from whatever you grow. Your own cabin on the property. Complete autonomy on the farming decisions." He paused. "In exchange for helping me understand how to make that land yield more than just grass for my cattle." Several onlookers had drifted closer, curiosity evident on their faces. Nora was acutely aware of how this conversation might appear a single woman discussing business with an unknown cowboy on a dusty street. "This is hardly the place for such discussions," she said quietly. Isaac nodded immediately. "The Wayfarer's Inn has a respectable dining room. We could discuss terms there. Bring anyone you'd like as a chaperone." Nora considered her options, which were admittedly few. Her rented room at the boarding house would only be hers for another week before her funds ran dry. Work was scarce for women unless she wanted to wash clothes or serve in the saloon, neither of which appealed to her. 7 o'clock, she decided. "I'll bring Mrs. Holloway, my landlady. Relief visibly washed over Isaac's face. "Perfect. I'll reserve a table." He hesitated, then added, "I'm not trying to trick you, Miss McKenzie. I truly believe we could help each other." As she watched him walk away, Nora felt a peculiar mixture of hope and trepidation. She'd come to Nebraska Territory with dreams of building something that was entirely her own, not becoming someone's partner, business or otherwise. Yet there was something in Isaac Barton's straightforward manner that stirred her curiosity. That evening, Nora sat rigidly across from Isaac at a corner table in the Wayfarer's Inn, Mrs. Holloway's substantial presence beside her providing both comfort and propriety. The older woman had raised skeptical eyebrows when Nora explained the meeting, but agreed to accompany her nonetheless. "So, Mr. Barton," Mrs. Holloway began after they'd ordered, "I understand you're proposing some sort of arrangement with Miss McKenzie regarding land." Isaac nodded, placing a folded map on the table. "Yes, madam, 200 acres total. The eastern 80 acres has rich soil, perfect for wheat, corn, maybe even some vegetable crops. The western portion is ideal for my cattle." He unfolded the map, pointing to a blue line. "There's a year-round creek running through it, more than enough water for both purposes. And this ridge here provides natural shelter from the winter winds." Nora leaned forward despite herself, studying the contours of what could have been her land. "And where would I live?" "There's an existing cabin here." Isaac pointed to a spot near the creek. "It needs work, but it's solid. I'd make improvements before you moved in." "And you'd live?" Mrs. Holloway asked pointedly. "I've been planning to build on the northwestern corner," Isaac replied smoothly. "Good distance away, madam. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more." Nora frowned, her fingers tracing the creek line on the map. "Why me, Mr. Barton? Surely there are more experienced farmers in Fort Kearney." Isaac's eyes met hers directly. "Because you care about the land itself. I watched you at those auctions." Others were looking at boundaries and prices. You were examining soil samples and asking about rainfall patterns. He paused. "My father always said to partner with people who love what they do. You love farming, don't you?" The question caught her off guard. Love wasn't a word Nora often applied to her practical life. Yet she couldn't deny the thrill she felt imagining seeds pushing through dark soil, fields of wheat rippling in the summer breeze. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "I do." Their food arrived, interrupting the moment. As they ate, Isaac outlined his proposal in greater detail. The arrangement would be formalized through a contract, giving Nora legal right to her portion of the profits and establishing her residence on the property. "And if I decide to leave?" Nora asked. "The contract would include provisions for that," Isaac assured her. "You'd be compensated for improvements you've made." Mrs. Holloway, who had been silently assessing Isaac throughout the meal, finally spoke. "You seem quite young to own such a substantial property, Mr. Barton." Isaac's fork paused midway to his mouth. Something flickered across his face, a shadow of memory, perhaps. "I served in the Union Army, madam, lost my older brother at Gettysburg. When we returned home to Illinois after the war, our parents had both succumbed to fever." He set his fork down. "The family farm was sold to pay debts, and I came west with what remained." "I'm sorry for your losses," Nora said softly. Isaac nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Life moves forward, Miss McKenzie. I believe in building something new rather than mourning what's gone." The rest of the meal passed in detailed discussion of crops, weather patterns, and market prices. By the time they finished, Nora felt both exhausted and exhilarated. For the first time since her father's death, she was thinking about future harvests instead of daily survival. "I'd like to see the land before deciding," she said as Isaac paid for their meal. "Of course, I can take you tomorrow if that suits." Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat meaningfully. With Mrs. Holloway accompanying us, naturally, Isaac added without hesitation. The following morning dawned clear and cool. Isaac arrived at the boarding house with a wagon, helping both women up to the bench seat with practiced ease. The drive took nearly 2 hours, during which Isaac pointed out landmarks and shared what he knew of neighboring properties. When they crested a gentle rise and the land spread before them, Nora felt her heart quicken. It was beautiful, more beautiful than she'd imagined from the auction maps. Rolling prairie gave way to a shallow valley where the creek curved like a silver ribbon. Stands of cottonwood trees provided natural windbreaks, and in the distance, the land rose again to form protective hills. Isaac pulled the wagon to a halt. "What do you think?" Nora couldn't answer immediately. She was too busy envisioning rows of corn following the contours of the land, a kitchen garden near the cabin, perhaps an orchard on the southern slope where it would catch the best sun. "It's perfect," she breathed finally. Mrs. Holloway snorted softly. "Nothing's perfect, child. Let's see this cabin he's offering before you start planting crops." The cabin proved to be better than Nora had expected, a sturdy structure with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that actually closed properly. It needed cleaning and some repairs, but it was far superior to the tiny room she currently rented. "The roof's new," Isaac explained, pointing upward. "Previous owner replaced it last year before he decided to head to California." Nora walked slowly around the interior, running her hand along the rough-hewn walls. "How long until planting season?" "About 3 weeks if the weather holds," Isaac replied. "Time enough to get you settled and the ground prepared." Outside, they walked the property line separating what would be her farming operation from his grazing land. The boundary followed natural features: the creek, a line of rocks, a change in elevation. "I've been thinking," Isaac said as they paused near the creek. "The contract should include water rights, equal access, regardless of whose portion it flows through." Nora nodded, impressed by his foresight. Her father had told her countless stories of water disputes turning violent. "That's wise." By the time they returned to town late that afternoon, Nora had made her decision. The opportunity was too good to pass up, despite her lingering caution about entering any arrangement with a man she barely knew. Isaac seemed honorable, but she'd protect herself with a solid contract nonetheless. 2 days later, they signed papers in the office of Harold Jenkins, Fort Kearny's only lawyer. The balding man raised his eyebrows several times as he reviewed the terms, particularly the provisions giving Nora equal water rights and autonomy over her portion. "Most unusual arrangement between unmarried parties," Jenkins commented, peering over his spectacles. "Most unusual times, counselor," Isaac replied evenly. "The war changed many things." Nora appreciated that Isaac didn't elaborate or justify their arrangement further. The truth was, traditional paths weren't available to her anymore. With her father gone and no relatives willing to take her in, she had to forge her own way. Within a week, Nora had moved her few possessions to the cabin. Isaac had been true to his word, making repairs to the door, patching holes in the walls, and even constructing basic furniture: a table, chairs, and a new bed frame. He'd also plowed the first 10 acres for her, leaving the soil turned and ready for planting. Their first weeks as neighbors established a pattern of polite distance. Isaac spent long days working with his small herd of cattle on the western portion of the property, while Nora planted her first crops with seeds she'd carefully preserved from her father's last harvest. They would exchange brief greetings when their paths crossed, update each other on progress, but little more. Nora preferred it this way. The last thing she wanted was complications that might jeopardize her fragile new beginning. Yet she couldn't help noticing things about Isaac Barton, the way he treated his horses with gentle patience, how he always tipped his hat when greeting her regardless of how dusty or tired he might be, the look of thoughtful concentration that creased his brow when he was solving a problem. Spring rains came generously that year, and Nora's first seedlings pushed through the soil right on schedule. Each morning she walked her fields at dawn, checking for signs of trouble and taking joy in the tiny green shoots reaching for the sun. By mid-June, the corn stood knee-high and wheat nodded in green waves across the eastern acres. One evening, as twilight softened the landscape, Nora sat on her small porch, mending a tear in her work dress. Movement caught her eye Isaac, returning from town with his wagon loaded with supplies. He raised a hand in greeting as he passed, then surprised her by pulling his horses to a halt. "Evening, Miss McKenzie," he called. "I've brought something for you." Curiosity drew her to her feet as he climbed down from the wagon and retrieved a wooden crate. He carried it to her porch, setting it down carefully. "What's this?" she asked. "Happened to be at the mercantile when a shipment arrived from back east." He gestured to the crate. "Garden seeds, more variety than what's available locally. Thought you might want to try some." Nora knelt beside the crate, opening it to find nearly 24 paper packets neatly arranged. Carrot, radish, several types of beans, 3 varieties of lettuce, even flowering plants like marigold and zinnia. "These must have cost a fortune," she said, looking up at him in surprise. Isaac shrugged, suddenly seeming uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Consider it an investment in our partnership. Good gardens make for good farms." Before she could thank him properly, he tipped his hat and returned to his wagon. Nora watched him drive away, the seed packets clutched in her hands, a warm confusion spreading through her chest. It was such a thoughtful gift, exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she'd had the means. The next morning, Nora staked out a garden plot near her cabin and began preparing the soil. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Isaac approaching until his shadow fell across the turned earth. "Morning," he said, holding a pair of wooden tools. "Brought these from my storage shed. Thought they might help." Nora straightened, pushing back a strand of hair with the back of her wrist. "What are they?" "Dibbers, for making holes for seeds at the right depth." He demonstrated, pressing one of the pointed wooden tools into the soil. "My mother swore by them for her kitchen garden." Nora accepted the tools, their smooth handles worn from years of use. "Your mother was a gardener." Something softened in Isaac's expression. "Best in our county. Could coax vegetables from stone, my father used to say." He glanced at the neat rows Nora had already marked out. "You remind me of her sometimes, the way you handle plants, like you're speaking to them without words." The comparison caught Nora off guard. It had been so long since anyone had connected her to family, to belonging. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the dibbers and the compliment." Isaac nodded, then gestured to the western fields. "I should get back. Need to mend that fence line before my cattle discover your corn." "Wait," Nora called as he turned to leave. Would you like to stay for supper tonight, as thanks for the seeds?" The invitation surprised them both. Nora hadn't planned to say it, but somehow the words had formed themselves. Isaac's smile came slowly. "I'd like that very much." That evening, Nora prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew, cornbread, and preserved peaches, the last jar from her mother's recipe. She'd never cooked for anyone but her father since her mother's death 6 years earlier, and she found herself unaccountably nervous. Isaac arrived promptly at sundown, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He'd brought a bottle of blackberry wine, purchased from a local widow who made it each summer. "Not much for strong spirits," he explained as he set it on her table. "But Mrs. Osgood's wine is something special." Their meal began with awkward politeness, but gradually warmed as they discovered shared interests beyond farming. Isaac had a surprising knowledge of literature, having been taught by his mother from their family's small collection of books. Nora confessed her love of drawing, a hobby she'd had little time for since her father's illness. "What do you draw?" Isaac asked, genuinely curious. "Plants mostly. My father thought it frivolous, but my mother encouraged it. She said understanding how things grow means seeing them truly." Isaac nodded. "Smart woman, your mother." He hesitated. "Would you show me sometime? Your drawings, I mean." The request was made so earnestly that Nora found herself agreeing, though she hadn't shared her sketchbook with anyone since her mother died. As the evening progressed, Isaac spoke more of his time in the army, not the battles, but the men he'd served with, the landscapes he'd seen traveling with Union forces. Nora shared stories of growing up on a small Illinois farm not unlike his family's had been. "Strange, isn't it?" Isaac mused as they finished the last of the blackberry wine. "We might have been neighbors back there, yet had to come all this way to meet." The thought lingered between them, comfortable and somehow significant. When Isaac finally took his leave, thanking her for the meal, Nora felt a curious reluctance to see him go. Summer unfurled across the Nebraska landscape in waves of green and gold. Nora's crops thrived, and her kitchen garden planted with Isaac's seeds produced more than she could eat alone. She began leaving baskets of fresh vegetables on his porch, and he reciprocated with fresh milk from the cow he'd recently acquired. Their suppers together became a weekly tradition, alternating between her cabin and the sturdy house he'd built on his portion of the property. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, water management during dry spells, strategies for the coming harvest, market prices in town. Other times they simply shared the comfortable silence of two people who no longer felt the need to fill empty spaces with words. Nora found herself looking forward to these evenings more than she cared to admit. Isaac was unlike any man she'd known, thoughtful rather than impulsive, more interested in asking questions than imposing answers. He listened when she spoke about crop rotation or soil amendments with the same attention he might give to a cattle buyer offering top dollar. One evening in late July, a violent thunderstorm swept across the prairie without warning. Nora had been checking her wheat field when the sky darkened ominously. By the time she reached her cabin, rain was falling in blinding sheets, driven by powerful winds that bent the young trees along the creek. She had just secured her door when a tremendous crack split the air, lightning striking terrifyingly close. Through her window, Nora saw flames erupting from a stand of trees near the property line. Even in the downpour, dry underbrush had caught fire. Heart pounding, she grabbed her rain cloak and ran outside. If the fire spread to her wheat field, months of work would be destroyed in minutes. The rain was already lessening, not enough to extinguish the growing flames. Halfway to the fire, she nearly collided with Isaac, also running toward the danger. His face was grim as he assessed the situation. "Get back to your cabin," he shouted over the storm. "My wheat," she began. "I'll protect it," he promised, "but I need tools. Shovels, blankets, anything to smother the flames." They split up, Isaac heading toward the fire while Nora raced back to gather supplies. By the time she returned with shovels and wet blankets, Isaac had already begun creating a firebreak, digging frantically to expose bare earth between the flames and her precious crops. For the next hour, they fought the fire together, beating at flames, smothering hotspots, working in desperate synchrony as the storm rolled away and left them exposed to the heat and smoke. Nora's arms ached, her lungs burned, but she wouldn't stop until the last ember was extinguished. When it was finally over, they stood side by side, soaked with rain and sweat, faces streaked with soot. The damage was contained to a small area of wild growth. Both his grazing land and her crops had been spared. "Thank you," Nora said, her voice hoarse from smoke. Isaac turned to her, his expression shifting from relief to concern. "You're hurt." Nora looked down to discover a burn on her forearm, a painful red welt where a flying ember had landed. In the heat of the moment, she hadn't even noticed. Without asking permission, Isaac gently took her arm, examining the burn in the fading light. "This needs tending," he said, his voice low. "My house is closer." Too exhausted to argue, Nora followed him to his home, a place she'd visited for meals but never entered alone with him. Under different circumstances, she might have worried about propriety, but the emergency had suspended such concerns. Isaac's house was simple but comfortable, with a larger main room than her cabin and a separate bedroom. He sat her at his table and retrieved a small tin of salve and clean bandages. "Army medicine," he explained, carefully applying the salve to her burn. "Not as good as a doctor's care, but it'll prevent infection." His touch was gentle as he wrapped her arm, his calloused fingers moving with surprising delicacy. Nora found herself studying his face, the line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple that she'd never noticed before, the way his eyes narrowed in concentration. "There," he said finally, securing the bandage. "Keep it clean and dry for a few days." "You're good at this," she observed. A shadow crossed his face. "Had too much practice during the war." Without thinking, Nora reached out with her uninjured hand and touched his arm. "I'm glad you were here tonight." Isaac covered her hand with his own, and for a moment, neither moved. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement of how quickly everything they'd built could have been lost, gratitude that they had faced the danger together rather than alone. "I should get you home," Isaac said finally, breaking the spell. "You need rest." He insisted on walking her back to her cabin, carrying a lantern to light their path through the darkness. At her door, he paused awkwardly. "I'll check your fields at first light," he promised. "Make sure no embers reignited." "Thank you, Isaac." It was the first time she'd used his given name instead of Mr. Barton. It felt right somehow after what they'd just shared. He noticed the change, a slight smile touching his lips. "Good night, Nora." As she watched him walk away, lantern light swinging gently with his stride, Nora acknowledged what she'd been avoiding for weeks. Her feelings for Isaac Barton had grown beyond neighborly appreciation or business partnership. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. August brought the wheat harvest, long days of backbreaking work that left little time for reflection on personal matters. Isaac hired 2 local men to help, and together they brought in Nora's first crop on the new land. The yield was better than she dared hope enough to sell at a profit and still keep seed for next year. The evening after the last wheat was threshed, Isaac suggested a celebration. "You've earned it," he said, his pride in her accomplishment evident. "First harvest is special." They shared a picnic supper on the knoll overlooking both their properties, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Isaac had brought a bottle of proper whiskey for the occasion, though Nora took only a small sip, preferring to remain clear-headed. "To successful partnerships," Isaac toasted, raising his cup. Nora touched her cup to his. "And to new beginnings." As darkness fell, they lay back on the blanket, gazing up at stars emerging in the vast Nebraska sky. The night was warm, cicadas providing a rhythmic backdrop to their conversation. "Did you ever imagine this?" Nora asked, gesturing to the land spread below them. "When you came west after the war, is this what you pictured?" Isaac was quiet for a moment. Not exactly, he admitted. I pictured the land, the cattle, but I thought I'd be doing it alone. He turned his head to look at her, his expression serious in the starlight. I never imagined you, Nora McKenzie. The simple honesty of his words made her heart race. Isaac, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know that my life is better with you in it, whatever form that takes. The space between them seemed both vast and infinitesimal. Nora was acutely aware of his proximity, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand rested just inches from hers on the blanket. Summoning courage, she moved her hand until their fingers touched. Isaac remained perfectly still, as if afraid the slightest movement might shatter this fragile moment. My life is better too, she whispered, slowly. Giving her every chance to pull away, Isaac leaned toward her. His kiss was questioning at first, then deeper as she responded. Nora had been kissed before, awkward fumblings behind the church social or hasty goodnight pecks on her father's porch, but never like this. Never with such tender certainty. When they finally parted, Isaac brushed a strand of hair from her face. I've wanted to do that since I saw you walking away from that auction. Nora smiled. Is that why you called after me? Because you wanted to kiss me? No, he said seriously. I called after you because I recognized something in you: determination, intelligence, a connection to the land. He paused. The wanting to kiss you came about 5 minutes later. Laughter bubbled up from Nora's chest, releasing the tension of the moment. Isaac grinned, pulling her into his arms as they lay back under the stars, talking until the moon rose high above the prairie. The weeks that followed were filled with stolen moments between work, hands touching as they passed tools, lingering glances across fields, quiet conversations that extended long into the evening. They were cautious, both still healing from past losses, neither willing to rush what was growing between them. In town, they maintained a professional appearance, though Nora suspected the knowing looks from Mrs. Holloway and other townsfolk meant their changing relationship hadn't gone unnoticed. Fort Kearney was small, and neighbors paid attention. Late September brought an unexpected visitor. Nora was canning tomatoes when she heard a wagon approaching. Looking out her window, she saw a fine carriage with 2 matched bay horses pulling up to her cabin, a vehicle far more elegant than any local farmer would own. A man in an expensive suit stepped down, surveying her property with a calculating eye. Something about his posture, confident to the point of arrogance, set Nora's nerves on edge. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto her porch. "Can I help you, sir?" The man turned, seeming surprised to find a woman addressing him. "I'm looking for the owner of this property." "You found her," Nora replied evenly. "I'm Nora McKenzie." The man frowned slightly. "I was told Isaac Barton owns this land. Mr. Barton and I have a partnership agreement. The eastern portion, including this cabin, is under my management." The man's expression shifted to one of polite dismissal. "I see. Well, perhaps you could direct me to Mr. Barton. I have a business proposition that might interest him." "He's working the northern pasture today," Nora said, pointing toward the hills. "But I'd be happy to discuss any business matters that involve this property." The stranger's smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is a matter best discussed between men, Miss McKenzie. Railroad business, you understand." Before Nora could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced Isaac's arrival. He must have seen the carriage from the ridge and come to investigate. His expression was guarded as he dismounted. "Whitley," Isaac said, recognition in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in Nebraska Territory." The man, Whitley, smiled broadly. "Barton, good to find you so easily. Your reputation preceded you. Everyone in town knew exactly where you'd settled." Isaac didn't return the smile. What brings Nebraska Central Railroad to my door? Opportunity, my friend. Whitley pulled a folded document from his coat. The line is expanding west from Omaha. We need land for the route, and your property sits right where we need to build. Isaac's jaw tightened. Not interested in selling. You haven't heard my offer. Whitley named a sum that made Nora's eyes widen, nearly 3 times what the land was worth by local standards. The price is generous because we're in a hurry, Whitley continued smoothly. Construction begins this winter. We need an answer within the week. The answer is no, Isaac said firmly. This land isn't for sale. Not to the railroad, not to anyone. Whitley's pleasant facade slipped momentarily. Don't be hasty, Barton. This train is coming through with or without your cooperation. Those who work with us prosper, those who don't. He left the implication hanging. Are you threatening me on my own property? Isaac asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Whitley raised his hands in a placating gesture. Simply stating facts. I'll leave the documents for your consideration. He placed the folded papers on Nora's porch railing. Think about it, Barton. This kind of money could set you up anywhere you want. Why stay tethered to this hardscrabble piece of nowhere? With that, he climbed back into his carriage and departed, dust billowing behind his expensive horses. Isaac stood watching until the carriage disappeared from view, his expression unreadable. Nora approached cautiously, aware that something significant had just transpired. You know him, she said. It wasn't a question. From before the war, Isaac confirmed. His family owned businesses near our farm in Illinois, always looking to expand, never caring who got trampled in the process. Nora picked up the documents Whitley had left, skimming the legal language. This offer is substantial. It's not about the money. Isaac turned to her, his eyes intense. This land, what we're building here, it matters. I won't sell out to men like Whitley who see only profit, not possibilities. Nora nodded slowly. I agree. But Isaac, if they want the land badly enough, they'll try to take it, he finished grimly. I know. Railroad companies have ways of getting what they want, legal and otherwise. That evening, they sat at Nora's table, poring over their property deeds and the railroad's documents. The proposed route would cut directly through both their sections, dividing the land and making it nearly impossible to continue their current operations. We should speak to Jenkins, Nora suggested, referring to the lawyer who had drawn up their partnership agreement. See what legal protections we have. Isaac nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Legal battles with railroad companies rarely end well for small landowners. They have teams of lawyers and connections in territorial government. Then what do we do? Nora asked. Isaac reached across the table, taking her hand. We fight smart, together. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Isaac rode to neighboring properties, discovering that many had received similar offers from the railroad. Some were considering selling, attracted by the generous terms. Others, particularly those who had worked their land for generations, shared Isaac and Nora's determination to resist. Nora, meanwhile, researched previous cases where landowners had successfully opposed railroad acquisition. She spent hours in the Territorial Records Office, taking notes on legal precedents and strategies. By the time Whitley returned the following week, they were prepared. The railroad representative seemed unsurprised to find them both waiting, documents spread across Nora's table. I see you've been studying, he commented, settling into the chair they offered. Have you reached a sensible decision? We have, Isaac replied. Our answer remains no, but we're prepared to discuss an alternative route. He unrolled a map they had prepared, showing a path that would take the railroad line along the northern boundary of their property, rather than through its center. This route adds less than 2 miles to your journey, Nora explained. The grade is actually more favorable for a train, and you'll only need to negotiate with one additional landowner instead of cutting across 7 properties. Whitley barely glanced at the map. Our surveyors have determined the optimal route. The company isn't interested in alternatives proposed by amateurs. Your optimal route appears to target the most productive farmland in the county, Isaac observed. Curious coincidence. Whitley's smile tightened. The railroad goes where progress demands, Barton. Now, I've been authorized to increase our offer by 15% as a final courtesy. We're not interested in selling at any price, Nora stated firmly. But we are willing to grant a right-of-way along the northern boundary as shown on our map. Those are the only terms we'll consider. Whitley stood abruptly. I had hoped for a reasonable conversation, but I see you've made your choice. He collected his hat. Nebraska Central will acquire the land it needs. Whether you benefit from that transaction is now entirely up to fate. After he left, Nora and Isaac sat in troubled silence. What did he mean by that? Nora finally asked. Isaac's expression was grim. It means they'll try other tactics. We should be prepared for anything. The warning proved prescient. Within days, rumors began circulating in Fort Kearney that Isaac was in financial trouble and looking to sell quickly. Lies clearly meant to isolate them from community support. Then a surveying accident led to a broken fence and several of Isaac's cattle wandering onto a neighbor's property, creating tension where none had existed before. Most disturbing was the night Nora awoke to the smell of smoke. Someone had set fire to her storage shed, destroying tools and seeds stored for the next planting season. Only quick action prevented the fire from spreading to her cabin or crops. Through it all, Isaac and Nora drew closer, their shared adversity cementing the feelings that had been growing between them. They began keeping watch in shifts at night, and neighbors who had initially been skeptical of their partnership now rallied around them, recognizing that their fight against the railroad was everyone's fight. October brought an unexpected ally. Harold Jenkins, the lawyer who had drawn up their partnership agreement, arrived at Nora's cabin one evening with news. The territorial legislature is reviewing railroad right-of-way statutes, he explained, accepting the coffee Nora offered. There's growing concern about Nebraska Central's aggressive tactics. You're not the only landowners fighting them. What does that mean for us? Isaac asked. Jenkins smiled slightly. It means you have time. The company can't legally proceed until the new regulations are established, likely not until spring. It was their first piece of good news in weeks. That night, after Jenkins departed, Nora and Isaac sat on her porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. We should celebrate, Isaac said, his arm around her shoulders. Nora leaned into his embrace. What did you have in mind? Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and absolute. Nora pulled back slightly to look at his face, searching for signs that he was joking. Isaac's expression remained serious. I know it seems sudden, but it's not really. I've known since that fire in July, maybe even before. I love you, Nora. I love your determination, your intelligence, the way you see possibilities in this land that others miss. He took her hands in his. I don't want a business partner anymore. I want a life partner. Nora's heart raced. She had been fighting her growing feelings, telling herself that their partnership was too important to risk on romance. Yet here was Isaac, laying his heart bare beneath the Nebraska stars. The railroad. She began. We'll still be there whether we face them as partners or as husband and wife, he finished. But I'd rather face everything with you beside me, officially and permanently. Nora took a deep breath. My father always said I was too independent for my own good, that no man would want a wife who had her own opinions about farming and business. Isaac smiled. Your father never met a man who needed those opinions as much as I do. His expression grew more serious. I'm not asking you to give up your independence, Nora. I'm asking you to share your life with someone who values that independence. In that moment, with the prairie stretched around them and the future uncertain, Nora made her decision. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Isaac's smile was brilliant in the moonlight as he gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. They were married 2 weeks later in Fort Kearny's small church. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on helping Nora prepare a proper wedding dress, nothing fancy, but a new blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Isaac wore his best shirt and a new vest, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, attended by neighbors who had become friends during their months of working the land, and especially during their battle against the railroad. Afterward, everyone gathered at Isaac and Nora's property for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. As guests began departing, leaving the newlyweds to their first night as husband and wife, Nora stood with Isaac on the porch of what was now their shared home, the larger house he had built, which would be more practical for a family. "Are you happy?" Isaac asked softly, his arm around her waist. Nora gazed out at their land, golden in the sunset light. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "When I walked away from that auction, I thought I was leaving behind my last chance at the life I wanted. And then I called after you," Isaac said, smiling at the memory. "You said I was your choice." Nora turned in his arms to face him. "But the truth is, you were mine too, I just didn't know it yet." Winter settled over the Nebraska prairie, bringing short days and long nights that the newlyweds spent planning for spring planting, making improvements to their home, and learning the rhythms of married life. The railroad matter remained unresolved, but the immediate pressure had eased as the territorial legislature continued its deliberations. In February, as snow blanketed their land in pristine white, Nora discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and renewed determination to protect what they had built together. "A child needs stability," Isaac said as they lay in bed one night, his hand gently resting on Nora's still flat stomach. "We need to settle this railroad business once and for all." An opportunity arose unexpectedly in late March. A letter arrived from the territorial governor's office, requesting that representatives from both sides of the railroad dispute appear for a public hearing in Omaha. Isaac and Nora, along with 2 neighboring landowners, were invited to present their case. The journey to Omaha was arduous for Nora, now in her 4th month of pregnancy. The jolting wagon ride over rough roads left her exhausted, but she insisted on attending the hearing. This was their future at stake, their child's inheritance. The territorial courthouse was intimidating, a grand building that made their small farm seem insignificant by comparison. Inside, representatives from Nebraska Central Railroad occupied one side of the room, their expensive suits and confident postures contrasting sharply with the plain clothing and weathered faces of the landowners. The hearing proceeded formally, with each side presenting arguments. The railroad's lawyers spoke eloquently about progress, economic development, and the greater good of the territory. When it was the landowner's turn, Isaac stood, but then surprised everyone by turning to Nora. "My wife knows this land better than anyone," he said. "She should speak for us." Whitley's face registered shock as Nora rose, straightening her best dress as she approached the front of the room. The governor, a stern-looking man with a bushy beard, raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to proceed. Nora had prepared carefully, but now she set aside her notes. Instead, she spoke from the heart about the land not as property to be bought and sold, but as a living entity that sustained them all. She explained how the railroad's proposed route would devastate not just their farm but the watershed that supplied the entire county. Then she presented their alternative map, explaining how the northern route would actually benefit the railroad in the long term by providing more stable ground for the tracks and avoiding seasonal flooding issues. "We are not against progress," she concluded. "But true progress works with the land, not against it. True progress considers the welfare of all citizens, not just those with the most money or influence. We ask only that Nebraska Central recognize there is a better way forward, one that allows both the railroad and the farmers to thrive." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Nora returned to her seat. Isaac squeezed her hand, pride evident in his eyes. The governor asked several penetrating questions of both sides before adjourning to consider the matter. The landowners waited anxiously in a small anteroom, while the railroad representatives conferred in hushed tones across the hallway. Just before sunset, they were called back. The governor's decision was unexpected but definitive. Nebraska Central would be granted right-of-way through the territory, but they would be required to follow the alternative northern route that Nora and Isaac had proposed. Furthermore, the governor added, looking directly at Whitley, any evidence of intimidation or property damage against landowners will result in immediate revocation of all railroad privileges in this territory. Whitley's face flushed with anger, but he maintained a rigid smile as he nodded acknowledgement of the ruling. Outside the courthouse, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Isaac lifted Nora off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "You did it," he whispered against her hair. "You saved our land." "We saved it," she corrected, her hands framing his beloved face. Together. They returned to Fort Kearny triumphant, their future suddenly clear and bright before them. The railroad would still come, progress was inevitable, but it would come on terms that respected their way of life and the land they cherished. That summer, as Nora's body swelled with new life, their farm flourished as well. The wheat grew taller than ever, corn stretched toward the sky in perfect rows, and Isaac's cattle grew fat on lush prairie grass. They hired 2 permanent farmhands to help with the expanding operation, building a bunkhouse near the barn for the men to live in. In August, just as the first wheat was being harvested, Nora gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after her father. The baby had Isaac's dark hair and Nora's determined chin, a perfect blend of them both. As Nora recovered from the birth, neighbors took turns helping with the harvest and bringing meals to the new parents. Mrs. Holloway practically moved in for 2 weeks, showing Nora how to care for the infant while ensuring the household continued to run smoothly. By October, life had settled into a new rhythm. Thomas grew stronger daily, his curious eyes taking in the world around him. Nora resumed many of her farm duties, often with the baby secured in a sling across her chest. Isaac proved to be a devoted father, spending evenings walking the colicky infant around their home when Nora needed rest. The railroad construction began that autumn, crews working to prepare the roadbed before winter set in. True to the governor's ruling, the tracks followed the northern route, skirting their property line without disrupting their operations. Isaac and Nora watched the progress with cautious optimism, knowing that the coming train would bring both challenges and opportunities. "We could expand," Isaac suggested one evening as they sat on their porch, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Nora's arms. "With the railroad so close, we could ship crops directly to eastern markets. Maybe add an orchard on that south slope you've been eyeing." Nora smiled, loving his vision for their future. "One step at a time. Let's see this little one walking before we plant 100 apple trees." Isaac leaned over to kiss her gently. "Have I told you today that you're the best decision I ever made? Better than buying this land," she teased. "The land would be nothing without you," he said seriously. "You make it home, Nora." As the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting their fields and pastures with white, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From that moment of dejection walking away from the auction to this a home, a husband who cherished her, a child of their own, and land that promised to sustain generations to come. "What are you thinking?" Isaac asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about choices," she replied. "How one moment can change everything." He nodded, understanding immediately. Like when a stubborn woman walked away from an auction and an equally stubborn cowboy couldn't let her go. "You called after me," Nora reminded him, smiling at the memory. "You are my choice," you said. "Best words I ever spoke," Isaac murmured, drawing her and their sleeping son closer against the gathering cold. "And I'd choose you again, every day, for all the days we have." Together they watched darkness settle over their land, secure in the knowledge that what they had built would endure not just the farm and the home, but the love that had grown between them, unexpected and perfect as prairie wildflowers after spring rain. 5 years passed in a blur of seasons: planting, growing, harvesting, resting. The railroad brought changes to Fort Kearny, transforming the small settlement into a bustling town. New businesses opened, more settlers arrived, and land prices rose steadily. Nora and Isaac's farm prospered beyond their early hopes. They added the orchard Isaac had suggested, along with a larger garden that produced vegetables for both their table and the growing town market. Their cattle operation expanded to include a small dairy that Nora managed with the help of 2 local girls seeking to learn farming skills. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's easy laugh and his mother's love of growing things. He had been joined by a sister, Emma, born on a crisp autumn night 2 years earlier. The children thrived in the freedom of farm life, learning its rhythms and responsibilities alongside their parents. One spring morning in 1873, as the family sat at breakfast planning the day's work, a knock came at their door. Isaac opened it to find Harold Jenkins standing on their porch, legal documents in hand. "Good news," the lawyer announced without preamble. "That land dispute with the Petersons has been resolved in your favor. The creek boundary stands as originally surveyed." Nora sighed with relief. The minor disagreement with their northern neighbors had been a rare source of tension in recent years. "That's not why I rode out here, though," Jenkins continued, accepting the coffee Nora offered. "There's a matter of some importance I need to discuss." He placed a newspaper on the table, the Omaha Herald, several days old. A front-page article announced the death of James Whitley, the railroad representative who had tried to force them off their land years ago. "What does this have to do with us?" Isaac asked, skimming the article. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Whitley left instructions in his will. He owned several properties across Nebraska Territory, including, surprisingly, a 200-acre parcel adjacent to yours on the east side." Nora and Isaac exchanged startled glances. They had known the neighboring property had been purchased by an investor from Omaha, but the owner's identity had been concealed through a holding company. "He's left it to you," Jenkins said, sliding a document across the table. "Both of you jointly." "That can't be right," Isaac protested. "The man hated us. Why would he leave us valuable land?" Jenkins shrugged. "The will includes a letter." He produced a sealed envelope bearing Isaac's name. Perhaps that explains his reasoning. After the lawyer departed, Nora and Isaac sent the children outside to play while they opened the letter. Isaac read it aloud, his expression changing from suspicion to wonder as he progressed through Whitley's final message, Barton and Mrs. Mackenzie Barton. By the time you read this, I will have departed this world. My doctors assure me it won't be long now. I've spent my life acquiring land, money, influence. Yet as I face my final accounting, I find these acquisitions hollow. What remains meaningful are the rare occasions when I encountered something that could not be bought. Your defense of your land 5 years ago represented such an occasion. Your wife's speech in the territorial courthouse has remained with me. Not because you defeated me, I've lost negotiations before, but because you showed me a different way of seeing the land, not as a commodity, but as a living partner. I purchased the property adjoining yours shortly after that hearing. Initially, I intended it as leverage for future railroad expansion. Over time, my purpose changed. I began visiting the property secretly, watching how you managed your land with respect and foresight. I have no children, no legacy beyond steel tracks and bank accounts. I leave you this land with one request. Continue to work it as you have your own, not exploiting, but collaborating with what nature has provided. Consider this my apology and my admiration. James Whitley. Silence filled the kitchen as Isaac finished reading. Outside, they could hear Thomas and Emma laughing as they chased each other around the yard. You believe him? Nora finally asked. Isaac refolded the letter carefully. I'm not sure it matters. The land is ours now, regardless of his motivations. Nora moved to the window, gazing east toward what was now their expanded property. The additional acreage would allow them to implement ideas they'd been discussing for years: crop rotation on a larger scale, perhaps a small apple orchard for commercial production. It feels like the closing of a circle, she said softly, from nearly losing everything to gaining more than we dreamed. Isaac came to stand beside her, his arms slipping around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Remember what you told me our first harvest. One step at a time. Nora leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. And look how far we've come, one step after another. That evening, after the children were asleep, Nora and Isaac walked to the knoll where they had shared their first kiss years before. The prairie stretched around them, bathed in moonlight, their original property, the newer sections they had acquired through hard work, and now Whitley's unexpected gift. I've been thinking, Isaac said as they stood hand in hand. We should establish a proper farm school. There are young people in town eager to learn, but without land or means to start. We could teach them what we've learned, help them get established. Nora smiled, unsurprised by his generosity. It was so characteristic of the man she had grown to love more deeply with each passing year. A way of passing on what we've built. Exactly. Isaac turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. When I called out to you at that auction, I had no idea where that moment would lead. I just knew I couldn't let you walk away. Your choice, Nora remembered, echoing his words from long ago. My choice then. My choice every day since. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been the first time. My choice for all our days to come. As stars wheeled overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of spring across the Nebraska prairie, Nora thought about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners in every sense of the word. They had built something precious on this land. Not just a farm, but a family, a future, a legacy. And it had all begun with a desperate auction, a bold proposition, and the courage to choose each other, day after day, through hardship and joy alike. "I love you, Isaac Barton," she whispered, her words carrying across the land that had become home. "And I love you, Nora McKenzie Barton," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss as enduring as the prairie itself. In the years that followed, the Barton farm became known throughout Nebraska Territory for its innovative farming practices and its open doors. The farm school Isaac had envisioned became reality, training dozens of young farmers who went on to establish their own successful operations throughout the expanding Western territories. Thomas and Emma grew up working alongside their parents, joined eventually by another brother, James, named in a gesture of reconciliation toward the man whose unexpected gift had helped expand their vision. The Barton children inherited not just land, but values respect for the earth, determination in the face of adversity, and the understanding that true wealth lay in community and family rather than possessions. Nora never forgot that pivotal moment when she had walked away from the auction, believing her dreams had ended only to have Isaac's voice call her back to a future brighter than she could have imagined. From that single choice had flowed a lifetime of purpose, love, and legacy that would continue long after they were gone. And when visitors asked how they had built such a remarkable life from such humble beginnings, Isaac would always smile at Nora and answer simply, "We chose each other." Everything else followed from that.